Daniel Carter, a 26-year-old man with tired eyes and a heavy heart, trudged through the rain-soaked streets of a small town in Oregon. The endless winter rains mirrored the gloom that seemed to engulf his life. His thin coat offered little protection against the downpour, but he barely noticed. The weight of student loans, his late father's debts, and the unrelenting pressure of completing his final year in medical school were suffocating. Each day felt like a step deeper into despair. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him from his thoughts. "This is Daniel Carter," he answered, his voice rough with fatigue. On the other end, a composed, authoritative woman's voice replied, "Mr. Carter, this is Vivian Gray. I'd like to meet with you to discuss your financial situation." Daniel frowned, suspicion flashing across his face. "I'm sorry, who are you? How do you even know about my situation?" But the voice cut him off smoothly, exuding an air of control. "I know enough to help you. Meet me at Edgewater Lounge at 8 p.m. This is important." The call ended abruptly, leaving Daniel stunned and uneasy. Questions swirled in his mind as he stood frozen in the rain. By nightfall, he found himself standing outside Edgewater Lounge, a cozy, upscale spot glowing with warm golden light. His pulse quickened as he hesitated on the threshold. Who was Vivian Gray? How did she know so much about him? And why did she seem so sure she could help? Compelled by a mix of desperation and curiosity, Daniel stepped inside, unaware that this single decision would set off a chain of events that would alter the course of his life forever. The call ended before Daniel could protest, leaving him both confused and intrigued. Curiosity outweighed his hesitation, and he made his way to the upscale Edgewater Lounge. The rain was relentless as he arrived, soaking through his jacket, which provided little defense against the cold. Pushing open the door, he was greeted by the warm glow of soft lighting and the inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. In a quiet corner, a striking woman sat with an air of quiet authority. Her silver hair was impeccably styled, and her tailored suit spoke of sophistication and immense wealth. "Daniel," she said, her calm yet commanding voice cutting through the murmur of the room. She gestured to the seat across from her. Daniel hesitated, his nerves tightening like a coil, but he finally took the seat opposite her. "Miss Gray," he began cautiously, "what's this all about?" "Straight to the point." "Good," she replied, lifting a delicate porcelain teacup to her lips. Her piercing blue eyes locked onto his. "I know about your debts," she said evenly, her words landing like a thunderclap. "The ones your father left behind. I know you're barely holding on. I'm here to offer you a solution." Daniel's brows furrowed, his skepticism clear. "And what would that be?" Vivian set her teacup down, her gaze unwavering. "Marry me." The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Daniel blinked, convinced he had misheard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," she said, her voice steady and devoid of hesitation. "This isn't about romance, it's a business arrangement. I'll pay off all your debts and secure your financial future. In return, you'll be my husband." The proposition was so startling, so absurd, that it left Daniel speechless. The gravity of her words and the icy certainty in her eyes made one thing clear: she wasn't joking. Vivian's tone was calm, her words unwavering. "In return for your security, you'll be my husband." Daniel let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "You're joking. Why me? You don't even know me." Vivian leaned forward slightly, her piercing blue eyes unyielding. "Precisely. You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this. I don't need love, Daniel. I need a companion, someone to share my name, my estate, and nothing more. Think of it as a contract." Daniel's mind raced, the absurdity of her words spinning in his head. "This is insane," he stammered. "What's in it for you?" For the first time, Vivian's expression softened, her steely demeanor cracking just enough to reveal a glimpse of vulnerability. "I've spent my life alone," she admitted. "I have no children, no family left. I want companionship, even if it's just for appearances. And I want control of my legacy. A husband will help solidify that." Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "I can't. I need time to think." "Of course," Vivian replied coolly, leaning back in her seat. "But don't take too long. The offer doesn't stand forever." The rain intensified as Daniel made his way home, soaking through his clothes and chilling him to the bone. That night, he sat at the worn kitchen table across from his mother, her pale face lined with worry. The cost of her medical treatments had drained what little they had left, and his younger sister's tuition loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. When he finally explained Vivian's proposition, his mother's hands trembled. "I know it sounds unthinkable," she said softly. But if she's willing to help, maybe it's worth considering. Daniel stared down at his hands, torn between pride and desperation. You're asking me to marry a woman I don't love, just to solve our problems? I'm asking you to save yourself, she whispered, her voice breaking. To save us? As Daniel finished explaining Vivian's shocking proposition, his mother's trembling hands gripped her cup of tea. I know it sounds unthinkable, she said softly, her voice heavy with worry. But if she's truly willing to help, maybe it's worth considering. Daniel stared down at his hands, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of pride and desperation. You're asking me to marry a woman I don't love, just to solve our problems? I'm asking you to save yourself, his mother replied, her voice cracking under the weight of her words. To save us? The next morning, Daniel returned to the Edgewater Lounge, his heart heavy with the decision he felt cornered into making. Vivian was already there, seated at the same table, her composure as icy and impeccable as ever. She didn't look up from her tablet as she asked, Have you decided? Daniel took a deep, steadying breath. I'll do it. Vivian smiled faintly, setting her tablet aside. Good. The arrangements will be made immediately. A week later, Daniel stood in a small courthouse, dressed in a tailored suit that Vivian had provided. The ceremony was brief and devoid of sentiment, witnessed only by Vivian's lawyer and a notary. As they exchanged vows, Daniel's chest tightened with unease, each word feeling heavier than the last. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, Vivian turned to him, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. Welcome to your new life, Mr. Carter, she said, her tone carrying both promise and forewarning. As they left the courthouse under a drizzle of rain, Daniel caught his reflection in a puddle. He hardly recognized the man staring back. A single thought echoed in his mind, have I just saved my family or have I sold my soul? Rain drizzled softly as Daniel stepped out of the courthouse, his reflection shimmering in a puddle at his feet. He stared at the man looking back at him, a question ringing in his mind like a tolling bell. Have I just saved my family or have I sold my soul? As his cab rolled up the long, winding driveway, the massive iron gates of Vivian Gray's estate creaked open. The mansion loomed ahead, a sprawling structure that could easily be mistaken for a museum. Its towering columns and immaculate stone facade spoke of old money and power, yet the windows seemed dark and lifeless, as though the house itself held secrets too heavy to bear. Daniel stepped out, his suitcase in hand, the surreal weight of his new reality pressing down on him. He felt like a stranger in someone else's dream, or perhaps someone else's carefully laid trap. Vivian greeted him in the grand foyer, her polished demeanor as impenetrable as ever. Welcome, Mr. Carter, she said, her formal tone slicing through the silence. The words sent a shiver down his spine. I trust you'll find everything to your satisfaction. Dinner is at 7? He nodded mutely, following a silent housekeeper who led him to his room. The space was the height of opulence, with a king-sized bed draped in luxurious linens, antique furnishings, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the meticulously manicured gardens. But for all its grandeur, the room felt cold, as though untouched by human warmth. That evening, Daniel sat stiffly at one end of an impossibly long dining table. Vivian, seated at the opposite end, was dressed impeccably, her silk blouse and understated pearls emphasizing her commanding presence. The silence between them was as heavy as the ornate chandelier hanging above, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into a game whose rules he didn't yet understand. At the other end of the grand dining table, Vivian sat impeccably composed, dressed in a silk blouse and pearls that glimmered faintly in the warm glow of the chandelier. The food before them was extravagant, filet mignon cooked to perfection, accompanied by an array of delicacies prepared by a chef Daniel hadn't seen and served by staff who moved like shadows, silent and efficient. I trust you're settling in, Vivian said, her voice as sharp and deliberate as the knife she used to slice her filet with surgical precision. Daniel shifted in his seat, choosing his words carefully. It's different. This place is enormous. Feels like I might get lost. Vivian smirked, a fleeting, almost mocking expression. You'll get used to it, or you won't. Either way, you're here. Her bluntness stung, but Daniel forced himself to remain composed. He hesitated, then ventured cautiously, You didn't mention much about your late husband. Vivian's knife paused mid-cut. Slowly, she dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin before answering, her tone darkening. He was a businessman, like your father. Their paths crossed once or twice. But as you might imagine, not all encounters end well. Daniel's pulse quickened. What do you mean? He pressed, unable to mask the unease in his voice. Vivian looked up, her piercing eyes locking onto his, sharp and unyielding. "Let's just say unfinished business has a way of lingering," she replied cryptically, lifting her glass of wine with deliberate grace. "But that's all in the past. Soon you'll understand why I chose you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with ambiguity, leaving Daniel unsettled. After dinner, he wandered the expansive halls of the estate, the house eerily quiet except for the faint creak of floorboards beneath his feet. The oppressive stillness seemed to whisper secrets he wasn't meant to hear, wrapping around him like a ghostly shroud. The faint creak of floorboards echoed under Daniel's footsteps as he wandered the endless halls of Vivian's estate. Brass-handled doors lined the corridors, each one locked and gleaming faintly in the dim light. They seemed to whisper dark secrets, calling to him with an unsettling allure. The stillness of the house, once impressive, now felt oppressive. As the days passed, unease began to consume Daniel. The staff avoided his gaze, their conversations reduced to hushed whispers whenever he was near. But he still managed to catch fragments of their words, snippets that sent chills down his spine. Why him? Does he even know? She never does anything without a reason. He'll figure it out eventually. They always do. The implications made his stomach twist, feeding the growing sense that he was a pawn in a game he didn't understand. One evening, pacing the library to distract himself, Daniel's eyes fell on Vivian's grand mahogany desk. Papers were scattered haphazardly across its surface, but what truly caught his attention was a small ornate key lying under the warm glow of a desk lamp. Its intricate design sparkled like a lure, drawing him closer. His gaze darted around the empty room, and his heart pounded as he reached for it. The key felt heavier than expected, its cool metal pressing into his palm. Questions raced through his mind. What does it open? Could it lead to one of those locked doors? And what would he find behind them? He glanced toward the hallway, where shadows danced like silent watchers on the walls. His breath quickened as he slipped the key into his pocket, the weight of it now symbolic of the tension in his chest. That night, lying in the suffocating luxury of his room, Daniel turned the key over in his hands. It gleamed in the faint moonlight, a tantalizing promise of answers, or perhaps dangers, waiting behind one of those forbidden doors. Daniel turned the key over in his hands, his thoughts a storm of questions. Yet one loomed larger than all the rest. What is Vivian hiding, and why did she really choose me? The stillness of the mansion was deafening as he crept through the dimly lit halls, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. The key in his pocket felt impossibly heavy, its cool surface pressing against his leg with each step. His pulse quickened as he approached the door that had caught his attention days earlier. Its ornate handle gleamed faintly in the silvery moonlight streaming through the tall windows. Glancing over his shoulder to ensure he was alone, Daniel inserted the key into the lock. The soft click that followed reverberated through the silence, sending a shiver racing down his spine. His breath hitched as he slowly pushed the door open, the heavy wood groaning softly on its hinges. Inside, the room was a relic of another era, untouched and frozen in time. Dusty furniture sat beneath faded wallpaper, and the faint scent of age hung in the air. On a table against the far wall, a collection of photographs in tarnished silver frames caught his eye. The images depicted a younger Vivian, smiling brightly beside a man who must have been her late husband. Another couple, unfamiliar to Daniel, appeared in several frames, their expressions warm and joyful. But it was the desk in the corner that truly drew his attention. Papers were scattered across its surface, their edges yellowed and fragile. With trembling hands, Daniel picked up the top sheet and began to read. His eyes widened as the words came into focus. Legal documents detailing failed business deals, accusations of fraud, and ruinous consequences. The names leapt out at him: Vivian Gray's husband and his own father. Daniel's breath hitched as realization struck. His father's dealings with Vivian's husband hadn't just been unfortunate, they had been catastrophic. Betrayal, deception, and financial devastation lay bare in the documents. His heart sank further as he flipped through more pages, finding a letter written in sharp, slanted handwriting. "You took everything from me. My family was left with nothing because of your lies. I will take everything from yours in return." The weight of the truth bore down on him. This wasn't just about companionship or legacy, it was revenge. Vivian hadn't chosen him by chance. She had orchestrated everything. Daniel stared at the papers, his mind racing as the faint creak of footsteps echoed behind him. He froze. "Enjoying yourself?" Vivian's icy voice sliced through the shadows, and Daniel turned, his heart pounding as he faced the woman who had just unmasked his darkest fears. The papers in Daniel's trembling hands painted a devastating picture. Failed business deals between Vivian's late husband and his father were meticulously detailed, and then came the letter, a damning accusation written in sharp, slanted handwriting. "You ruined everything. My family was left with nothing because of your lies." The words seemed to leap off the page, each one heavier than the last. Daniel's breath hitched as his gaze landed on the final document in the stack, a marriage license. His own name and Vivian's were boldly printed, dated weeks before their wedding, far earlier than he'd been led to believe. The revelation sent a chill racing down his spine. On the desk lay an old leather-bound diary, its worn cover an invitation Daniel couldn't resist. He hesitated for only a moment before opening it. The entries were written in Vivian's unmistakable hand, each page revealing more of her chilling intent. The truth was stark and inescapable. She had orchestrated their marriage as part of a calculated plan. "I will take everything from him just as his father took everything from me. He will be my pawn." The weight of her words crushed him. This wasn't about companionship, legacy, or even a fresh start. It was revenge, meticulously crafted and mercilessly executed. Daniel froze as the door behind him creaked, the sound sharp and jarring in the silence. His heart raced. "Enjoying yourself?" Vivian's icy voice cut through the darkness like a blade, freezing him in place. He spun around, guilt and fear written all over his face. "Vivian, You thought you'd find answers here," she interrupted, stepping further into the room, her silhouette sharp against the dim light from the hallway. Her tone dripped with venom. "Curiosity killed the cat, Daniel. What exactly were you hoping to uncover?" Her piercing gaze pinned him in place, and for a moment, the silence stretched unbearably. Every instinct screamed at Daniel to run, but he knew there was no escape from the storm he had just unleashed. "What do you think you're doing?" Daniel demanded, his voice low but resolute, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "Why did you really marry me? Is this about my father? Is this some kind of revenge?" Vivian's icy composure cracked, her hardened gaze locking onto his. "It's not your place to ask questions, Daniel," she hissed. "Just do what you're told and you'll leave this marriage better off than you started. Isn't that enough for you?" "No, it's not enough." Daniel shot back, his voice rising. "You've lied to me, manipulated me. This isn't a marriage, it's a trap." A faint, humorless smile curled Vivian's lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. "A trap, you say? Maybe you should have thought twice before signing those papers." Her tone turned venomous as she stepped closer, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "You think you're smart, Daniel, but you're just like your father, blind to the destruction you cause until it's too late." Daniel's chest tightened under the crushing weight of her accusations. "If you hated him so much," he shot back, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and pain, "why take it out on me? I had nothing to do with what he did to your family." Vivian stared at him for a long, unbearable moment, the silence between them taut like a stretched string on the verge of snapping. Finally she turned on her heel, her voice cutting through the tension like a dagger. "You're in over your head, Daniel. Stay out of matters that don't concern you." Her words hung in the air as she walked away, her footsteps fading into the oppressive silence of the mansion. Daniel stood there, his thoughts a whirlwind. The legacy of his father's sins weighed on him anew, but now it was entangled with Vivian's calculated thirst for vengeance. He clenched his fists tighter, a fire igniting within him. This time he wouldn't let himself be a pawn in her twisted game. With that, Vivian strode out of the room, her footsteps echoing faintly down the dim hallway. The mansion fell into silence, but the weight of her words lingered like a storm cloud over Daniel's thoughts. That night, he lay wide awake in the stifling luxury of his bed, his mind racing with questions and fears. Vivian's sharp words haunted him, but so did the damning documents and diary he'd uncovered. Why had she gone to such lengths to trap him in her schemes? Was it truly just about revenge, or was there something even darker at play? Just as exhaustion began to creep in, a faint sound broke the stillness, the low murmur of Vivian's voice. Heart pounding, Daniel slipped out of bed and crept through the silent halls, drawn toward her study like a moth to a flame. Pressing his ear against the heavy door, he strained to hear her words. "Make sure the transfer is complete," Vivian's voice commanded, cold and precise. "We can't let him back out now. Time is running out." Daniel's blood turned to ice. Whatever was happening, it was far worse than he had imagined. His chest tightened as realization dawned. He was caught in a web far more sinister than a simple vendetta. Later, Daniel sat alone in the grand library, his thoughts a turbulent whirlpool of fear and confusion. Vivian's cryptic words and the incriminating contents of the locked room painted a chilling picture. The once impressive estate now felt like a gilded prison, its opulence concealing a sinister reality. Desperate for answers, Daniel sought out Mr. Harris, the estate's head butler. The man's calm demeanor and weathered expression suggested he had seen and heard far more than he let on. "Mr. Harris," Daniel began, his voice trembling with urgency. "I need your help. Something isn't right here." The older man regarded Daniel with a measured gaze, his hands clasped behind his back. For a moment, the air between them was thick with unspoken truths. Finally, Mr. Harris spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "You're not the first young man to be drawn into Vivian's world," he said. "She's clever, resourceful, and ruthless. My advice to you, Mr. Carter? Watch your back. Mr. Harris, I need your help." "Something isn't right here," Daniel said, his voice heavy with desperation. The older man regarded him with a steady gaze, his hands clasped behind his back as though bracing for what was to come. "I was wondering how long it would take before you came to me," Mr. Harris replied, his tone even, betraying no surprise. "You know something, don't you? About Vivian, about all of this," Daniel pressed, the tension in his chest growing unbearable. Mr. Harris hesitated, his eyes briefly flickering with something unspoken. Then, with a sigh, he admitted, "You're not the first young man to be drawn into Vivian's world, Mr. Carter. She's clever, resourceful, and ruthless when it comes to achieving her goals. My advice? Watch your back." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "If you know what she's capable of, why are you still here?" The butler's expression softened, and a flicker of regret passed across his weathered face. "Some of us don't have the luxury of walking away," he said quietly, his words tinged with a resigned sadness. Determined to find a way out, Daniel began formulating a plan. That evening he contacted Peter, a trusted friend from law school, under the guise of a casual catch-up. "Peter, hypothetically speaking, if someone signed a contract under coercion or false pretenses, is there a way to void it?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his tone light. Peter leaned back, curiosity sparking in his eyes. "Hypothetically. Yes, but it depends on the evidence. Are you in some kind of trouble?" Daniel quickly deflected, forcing a nervous laugh. "No, just a class project. But thanks, that helps a lot." Peter's words gave Daniel a glimmer of hope, but he knew the road ahead would be treacherous. With each step, he was piecing together the puzzle of Vivian's schemes, but the weight of her calculated manipulations loomed like a shadow, reminding him that escape wouldn't come easily, or without risk. "Just a class project I'm working on, thanks man," Daniel said to Peter, trying to sound casual. But as the call ended, his determination hardened. The next few days were spent searching Vivian's office whenever she was away, his heart pounding with each creak of the floorboards, hoping to uncover something that explained her chilling obsession with his father. Late one night, his persistence paid off. Rifling through the ornate desk, Daniel's fingers landed on an envelope addressed to his father. The letter inside was a scathing condemnation, written in Vivian's sharp, slanted handwriting. Each word dripped with venom. "You left us with nothing. My husband's heart couldn't take the stress, and now he's gone because of you. I will see to it that your family pays for what you've done." Daniel's stomach churned as he read. The truth was clearer than ever. Vivian's actions weren't about reclaiming wealth or legacy, they were fueled by years of pain, anger, and an unrelenting thirst for revenge. His father's past mistakes had cost Vivian everything, and now she was determined to exact her retribution on him. Returning the letter to its hiding place, Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't allow himself to remain a pawn in her cruel vendetta. That night, he began mapping out potential escape routes from the mansion, sketching plans on scraps of paper while the oppressive silence of the estate pressed down on him. But Vivian's sharp instincts didn't miss a thing. She noticed the shift in his demeanor, the flicker of unease in his gaze. The following morning, her piercing eyes met his across the breakfast table, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've been busy, haven't you, Daniel?" she said, her tone icy and unnervingly calm. "Careful where your curiosity leads you, it might take you somewhere you don't want to go." The next morning, Vivian's icy presence cut through the quiet of the breakfast room like a blade. She entered with a cold smile that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. "You've been busy, haven't you, Daniel?" she said, her voice calm but laced with menace. Daniel froze, his spoon hovering midway to his mouth. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, his voice faltering. Vivian's smile widened, but it was devoid of warmth. "Don't play coy with me, Daniel. If you think you can outsmart me, you're sorely mistaken. I've dealt with far craftier opponents than you." Swallowing hard, Daniel fought to keep his voice steady. "I don't know what you're accusing me of, but I'm not doing anything wrong. Vivian leaned in, her face inches from his, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "If you betray me, you'll wish you hadn't. Remember that?" Straightening, she left the room with an air of finality, her footsteps echoing ominously as she disappeared down the hall. Daniel sat frozen, his heart pounding. The realization struck him like a hammer. Escape might be more dangerous than staying, but staying meant surrendering his life to her twisted plans, a fate he refused to accept. That afternoon, Daniel paced the library, the air in the estate feeling thick and suffocating. The weight of his discoveries pressed heavily on his shoulders. The private investigator he had secretly hired had just left, leaving behind confirmation of his worst fears. Vivian's late husband, Harold Gray, had been ruined by Daniel's father in a fraudulent deal. The financial devastation had been catastrophic, and Harold's death from a heart attack soon after sealed Vivian's descent into bitterness and revenge. Daniel clenched his fists as anger coursed through him. She had crafted an elaborate plan, fueled by years of pain, to make him pay for sins that weren't his own. But as much as he hated her manipulation, he couldn't ignore the suffering that had driven her. Now he had a choice to make: escape, confront her, or find a way to outmaneuver her entirely. Harold Gray had been swindled by Daniel's father in a fraudulent real estate deal, a betrayal that stripped the Gray family of their fortune. The financial ruin was devastating, but the final blow came when Harold suffered a fatal heart attack shortly afterward. The tragedy left Vivian embittered, her pain morphing into a relentless determination for revenge. Her proposal to marry Daniel had been more than a calculated plan. It was her way of making his family suffer, even from beyond the grave. Every piece of the puzzle now fit, and Daniel's fists clenched in anger. How could she hold him accountable for his father's sins? Yet, as much as he resented her manipulation, he couldn't entirely deny the pain that had driven her to such extremes. That evening, Daniel met his law school friend Peter in secret. Under the guise of catching up, Daniel revealed the damning evidence he had collected from Vivian's office and the investigators' findings. Together, they pored over the documents, uncovering more than just her vendetta. Vivian's current business dealings were riddled with corruption, shady partnerships, falsified reports, and underhanded schemes meant to rebuild her empire at any cost. "This is enough to take her down," Peter said, his voice low but resolute. "But you need to be careful, Daniel. If she realizes you're onto her, there's no telling what she might do." Daniel nodded grimly, the weight of Peter's warning sinking in. The stakes were higher than ever, and the consequences of any misstep could be catastrophic. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let Vivian continue her reign of manipulation and revenge unchecked. With the evidence in hand, he resolved to confront her, knowing it might be the most dangerous decision of his life. "She's already done enough damage," Daniel said grimly to Peter. "It's time to end this." The next morning, Daniel sat in the grand sitting room of the estate, his bag securely hiding the damning evidence he had collected. His heart pounded as he waited for Vivian, every second stretching like an eternity. When she finally entered, her icy composure was as sharp as ever, her expression unreadable. Daniel rose to his feet. "Vivian, we need to talk." She arched an eyebrow, her tone clipped and dismissive. "Is that so? What could possibly be so urgent?" Steeling himself, Daniel pulled the documents from his bag. His voice was firm, unwavering. "I know everything, about my father, about Harold, and about what you've been doing to rebuild your fortune." For the first time, a crack appeared in Vivian's icy facade. Her eyes flicked to the papers in his hand, a flash of alarm crossing her face before she quickly masked it. "You've been snooping again, haven't you?" she said, her voice colder now. "Do you even understand what your father did to my family?" Daniel stepped closer, his voice rising with each word. "I understand that he wronged you, but what about the people you've hurt along the way? What about me? I didn't do anything to deserve this." Vivian's jaw tightened, her composure slipping further. "And my family deserved to lose everything?" she snapped. "My husband deserved to die of stress and heartbreak while your father lived comfortably? Don't lecture me about fairness, Daniel." Daniel's hands trembled as he held the evidence, his voice shaking with both anger and resolve. "Revenge won't bring him back, Vivian. It won't undo what happened. All you've done is spread the pain you suffered. When does it end?" Her piercing gaze met his, filled with a mix of defiance and something that almost resembled regret. The silence between them was electric, charged with years of grief, anger, and the consequences of their shared history. Daniel knew he was standing at the precipice of something that could either free him, or destroy them both. Daniel held up the stack of damning evidence, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Revenge won't bring him back, Vivian. It It won't undo what happened. You've spent your life consumed by this, hurting innocent people, ruining lives. When does it end? For a moment, Vivian's shoulders sagged slightly, and her steely exterior softened. In her eyes, Daniel thought he saw a flicker of something almost human, regret. You remind me of him, you know, she said softly, her voice uncharacteristically tender. Harold. That same fire, that same stubbornness. I didn't expect to feel anything for you, Daniel. But here we are. Her admission caught him off guard, and he hesitated. If you really feel that way, he said carefully, then stop this. Let it go before it's too late. Vivian opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the distant crunch of car tires on gravel interrupted the tense moment. The sound grew louder, echoing ominously through the estate. Moments later, uniformed police officers stepped into the room, Peter following closely behind them. One officer stepped forward, his tone firm and authoritative. Vivian Gray, we have a warrant for your arrest. You're being charged with multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. Vivian's face hardened as she processed the scene unfolding before her. Her sharp gaze shifted to Daniel, her voice cold and biting. You called them? Daniel met her eyes, his voice steady but resolute. You left me no choice. As the officers cuffed her and began to lead her away, Vivian turned back one last time, her piercing eyes locking onto his. You may think you've won, Daniel, she said, her tone low and venomous. But revenge doesn't end with me. Be careful it doesn't consume you too. Her words hung heavy in the air as she disappeared down the corridor, leaving Daniel standing in the echoing silence of the grand estate. A mixture of relief, sadness, and uncertainty settled over him. He had exposed her crimes and freed himself, but the weight of her parting words lingered, a haunting reminder of the cycles of pain and vengeance they had both endured. Vivian turned back to Daniel one last time, her piercing eyes meeting his. You may think you've won, Daniel, she said, her voice quiet but laced with venom. But revenge isn't so easily undone. Be careful it doesn't consume you too. Daniel stood frozen, watching as she was led away. A complex mix of relief and sadness washed over him. He had exposed the truth and protected himself, but her parting words lingered in the back of his mind. Was she right? Could the shadow of their shared past ever truly fade? The sharp bang of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the end of Vivian Gray's trial. Daniel sat silently in the back row, watching the woman who had once held so much power face the consequences of her actions. Despite everything she had done, his testimony had helped reduce her sentence. It wasn't out of sympathy but out of a deep understanding of the complexities of their story, a shared history marked by pain, betrayal, and unexpected humanity. As the verdict was read, Vivian turned briefly in her seat, her gaze finding Daniel's. For the first time, there was no cold calculation in her expression. Instead, she offered him a faint, almost apologetic nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even an unspoken truce. Days later, Daniel was summoned to the estate one final time. The grand house, once imposing and oppressive, now felt empty and devoid of its former menace. Standing in the echoing halls, he was handed a letter in Vivian's elegant handwriting. This estate was once a monument to my pain, but it no longer needs to be. Use it for something greater than vengeance. You taught me that there's more to life than holding on to the past. Daniel sold the estate soon after. Its proceeds went to pay off his family's debts and establish a scholarship fund in Harold Gray's name, a way to honor a man caught in the crossfire of another's greed. With the shadows of the past behind him, Daniel returned to law school, determined to use his education to help others who had been wronged, just as he had been. As he walked away from the estate for the last time, he glanced at the clear sky above, feeling a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying begin to lift. Vivian's parting words remained with him, a quiet reminder to break the cycle of vengeance and find peace in redemption. The once imposing and isolating mansion now stood empty, its echoes carrying the weight of a story that had finally reached its conclusion. Daniel was summoned back one last time to receive the property's deed. The estate lawyer handed him a letter in Vivian's elegant handwriting, her words as measured as they were surprising. It was never about the money, Daniel. It was about closure. Harold deserved justice, but I lost sight of what truly mattered. You've shown me something I thought I'd forgotten, the capacity to move forward. This estate is no longer a monument to my pain, it can be something more. Use it well. Selling the estate was a decision that came easily to Daniel. Its grandeur, which had once felt like a gilded cage for both him and Vivian, no longer held any meaning. The proceeds allowed him to pay off his family's debts, finally freeing his mother from the shadow of his father's mistakes. With the remaining funds, Daniel established a scholarship fund in Harold Gray's name, a way to honor a man who had unknowingly become a casualty in the bitter feud between two families. Returning to law school felt like a homecoming. But this time, Daniel was more resolute than ever. He dedicated himself to using his education for good, interning at a legal aid center to help individuals who, like him, had been wronged and left with few options. Each case he took on became a small step toward justice and healing. As he walked the campus one crisp autumn afternoon, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The weight of Vivian's revenge and his father's sins had finally lifted, leaving him with clarity and purpose. He no longer felt bound by the past but inspired to ensure others wouldn't suffer the way he had. In his pocket he kept the letter from Vivian, a quiet reminder of the power of redemption, closure, and the courage to break free from cycles of pain. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the stirrings of hope and the promise of a brighter future. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves rustled softly in the breeze, a letter arrived for Daniel. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. Sitting on a park bench near campus, he carefully unfolded the paper, his breath catching as he began to read. Daniel, I've had much time to reflect. For years, I believed that revenge would heal the wounds Harold's death left behind, but I see now that revenge is its own prison. Your kindness, even in the face of my mistakes, taught me something I never expected. Forgiveness is not weakness, it is strength. Thank you for being better than the world around you. Thank you for showing me that we can break the cycles we inherit. I hope you find the happiness I never could. Vivian. Daniel stared at the letter for a long time, letting the weight of her words settle in his heart. Slowly, he folded it and tucked it into his jacket pocket, feeling an unexpected sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't just the end of her story, it was a turning point in his own. A year after Vivian's arrest, Daniel stood before a group of scholarship recipients at a modest ceremony. Behind him hung a simple yet powerful plaque, the Harold Gray Scholarship Fund for Second Chances. Speaking with quiet conviction, Daniel addressed the crowd. This fund isn't just about money. It's about creating opportunities for those who've been overlooked, those who need a second chance. It's about turning pain into purpose and breaking free from the cycles of the past. After the ceremony, Daniel lingered for a moment in the crisp air, reflecting on how far he had come. Vivian's letter remained in his pocket, a quiet reminder of the lessons they had both learned, about redemption, forgiveness, and the strength it takes to move forward. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a profound sense of hope, ready to embrace the life he had fought so hard to reclaim. The ceremony ended, but its meaning lingered. Daniel sat alone on a bench near the venue, reflecting on the whirlwind of the past year. His path had been irrevocably altered by the choices he'd made, but for the first time he felt like he was walking in the right direction, toward something meaningful, something true. As the crisp autumn air brushed against his face, Daniel rose and began to walk away. A soft smile touched his lips as he glanced up at the clear sky. The weight of the past, which had burdened him for so long, finally seemed to lift. In his pocket, Vivian's letter rested, a quiet yet powerful reminder of the lessons they had both learned, about redemption, justice, and the transformative power of forgiveness. This journey had taught him that even in the face of betrayal and hardship, the choices we make can lead to healing and new beginnings. He carried that truth with him, ready to face the future with purpose and resolve. Daniel's story is a testament to resilience and the hope that lies in second chances. In a world often consumed by pain and revenge, his journey reminds us that forgiveness and compassion are the keys to breaking cycles and building something better. As Daniel disappeared into the horizon, his smile spoke of a life reclaimed and a brighter future ahead, a life where pain had been turned into purpose, and the lessons of the past had paved the way for a new beginning. If you enjoyed this heartfelt journey through resilience, redemption, and the power of forgiveness, don't forget to subscribe to Soul Deep Stories. Our tales are crafted to move your soul, remind you of the enduring strength of compassion, and inspire you to embrace love and second chances. Love cannot coexist in a heart filled with pain, revenge, and doubt. Love should begin with sincerity and true affection. Even if your heart is imprisoned and bleeding from the wounds of the past, God still gives you a second chance to rebuild your life. Don't let hatred obscure the path to your future, and don't let the temptation of money cause you to lose your own happiness. Money is merely external and has never been the key to true joy. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more wonderful stories in the next videos. Thank you for being part of this incredible story. We'll see you next time with another tale that touches your heart and uplifts your spirit. Until then, take care, cherish the lessons life brings, and never forget the transformative power of kindness and hope. Red Heart.